I'm Candy Crowley on the National Mall in Washington, D.C. President Barack Obama's second term begins in a little more than 2 hours from right now, when he'll be taking the oath of office in a private ceremony at the White House. Joining me here to talk about that second term, former Democratic Senator Russ Feingold, former House Speaker Newt Gingrich, USA Today's Susan Page, our own CNN political analyst Ron Brownstein. Thank you all for being here. Let me talk first about just the general tone in Washington now, because we've had a pretty rough 6 weeks, both on the Democratic side, the president's side, and the House side. And from what we hear, he's going to be up there talking about unity tomorrow. What will it be the day after?
Well, I think things are moderating. I think the president's tone will be terrific. People know he won the election by on a decisive basis. And I think people on the Republican side are seeing that being confrontational and obstructionist is not going to work for them either. So I am a little more optimistic than maybe you are about that.
That you think Republicans, but
well, both sides.
A lot of the both sides.
I do think that.
Because the president's been pretty tough, Mr. Speaker.
Well, the president has been, but I think that there's a desire that extends beyond that. I did a show with Tavis Smiley and Congresswoman Marcia Fudge, who's the new head of the Congressional Black Caucus, was on the panel talking about poverty. And we worked out an agreement that she's going to go to her Congressional Black Caucus and ask those 42 members to go to 42 Republican districts for 3 days. And I'm going to ask Republicans to then go to match up and go to the 42 districts. So you actually would have a genuine dialogue for 6 days in which members from both sides are sharing ideas. I think you need that kind of fundamental structural innovation in order to break out of the current bitterness and to get to a better, but I think people want to do that. I think that they're sick of the constant fighting and obstruction.
I think you certainly know that from the American public, and it's that whole thing, you can't meet in the middle if you don't know where the other person's coming from.
Right.
And so, Ron, you know, when you look ahead, I talked to David Plouffe earlier. Right. He said, look, I think we're going to get, I think we got 60 votes in the U.S. Senate for, you know, bringing down the capacity of those magazines. I think we've got 60 votes for universal background checks, but doesn't sound like that, even when you talk to some Democrats.
Well, look, the positive example of a second term is something both Speaker Gingrich and Senator Feingold lived through. It was 1997, where the country returned divided government, a Democratic president with a Republican Congress, and they were able to come together on a big agreement on the budget in 1997. I mean, you kind of looked at each other and say, what are we going to do? We're going to wait 4 years, try to wait each other out? There really is no alternative but working together. And I think if you know, that's the positive kind of precedent that you could point to. On a lot of these issues, it's going to be hard. I mean, gun control is obviously an issue that historically has divided both parties, and traditionally red state Democrats have voted against it. In the past, in 1994, they were able to pass it because they could compel blue state Republicans to fill in those votes. Immigration, I think the prospects are better. I think there is going to be an issue where there are going to be a large number of Republicans, especially in the Senate, who see an incentive in getting something done. And the question will be, can John Boehner bring up yet another bill in the House that a majority of House Republicans are likely to oppose? And I'd be interested in the Speaker's thought on how many times you can do that and remain Speaker.
Let me get Susan in, and then I'll have you answer that question.
I hope the Senator and the Speaker are right, that this is a time we should be optimistic. I have a hard time seeing it. Contrast this tone with what we saw 4 years ago when Barack Obama was inaugurated in the first time, and there was a great swelling, I think, of hope that he would be able to break the partisan gridlock, that there would be a new kind of politics. We haven't seen that. In fact, we see President Obama moving toward a more traditional kind of politics, which is much more confrontational on issues including the debt ceiling, including gun control. I think immigration is an issue on which there may well be a political consensus, but I think it's hard to see the two sides coming together in a significantly new bipartisan way on most of these other issues.
And some of the, you know, on the debt, on gun, immigration is in the interest of the Republican Party to get off the table.
Well, before this candidate, the last candidate for president, the last two candidates for president on the Republican side, George Bush and John McCain, were for comprehensive immigration reform. There's enormous support among Republicans in my state for immigration reform, and it's just something that's essential to the economy as well as so important to so many other people in our country. So I am really actually more optimistic about that than just about anything.
You guys are a happy pair today.
Well, no, look, I think that Susan made a key point. But remember, this is not just the president and vice president and then the Congress as though it's all binary. There are 537 elected officials in this city. They can do lots of different things that create different environments. When Callista and I left the inaugural in 2009, the president had given 3 great speeches, one here just before the election in Northern Virginia, one at Grant Park, and then the inaugural address. And I said, you know, if he governs like those 3 speeches, he'll be Eisenhower, and he'll split the Republican Party. 3 or 4 weeks later, he sits down with Nancy Pelosi and Harry Reid. They pass $780 billion in stimulus with no one having read the bill, and the Republicans go, got it. And the speeches were irrelevant. The president tomorrow is going to sound right, okay? If he follows through on tomorrow's speech, he has a chance to be Eisenhower. I don't think he will. I think he wants to be Roosevelt in his 2nd term, but that's neither here nor there. Congressional Republicans can reach out on issues. Take the case of gun control. I think the House Judiciary Committee ought to hold hearings in Chicago. This is the president's hometown. The mayor is the president's former chief of staff. They have very strict gun control, and they are the murder capital of the United States. They had 516 dead last year. Now, I think having a hearing on what happened before we rush into the next, panacea would be a very useful exercise on a nonpartisan basis.
You know, this idea and the other idea the speaker talked about members of the Black Caucus going into kind of Republican districts is kind of fascinating, because part of the problem we have is that our disagreements have been sorted out into the 2 parties almost precisely. I mean, they are really representing very different Americas at this point. 80% of the House Republicans are in districts that are more white than the national average in their population. 2/3 of Democrats are in districts that are more non-white than the national average. I mean, the Republican coalition in this last election, 90% of Mitt Romney's votes came from whites in a country that's now almost 40% non-white. And, you kind of look up and down at these issues, and they are representing very different coalitions that don't feel a great affinity for one another. And so it requires a kind of leadership in some ways for the leaders to lead their voters, I think, toward accepting the reality that we're a closely divided country, and none of us are going to go away. Either we're going to stalemate, or we're going to find ways to bridge our differences.
Let me ask all of you to stand by. We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, I want to talk a little bit about foreign policy and maybe just a tiny bit about 2016. We are back with former Senator Russ Feingold, former House Speaker Newt Gingrich, and the stellar Susan Page and Ron Brownstein. Thank you all for being here. I want to play you, this is a couple of bites of the president talking about Al-Qaeda and terrorism.
Al-Qaeda is on the path to defeat.
The war in Afghanistan is winding down. Al-Qaeda has been decimated.
Al-Qaeda's on the run, and bin Laden is dead.
So my question out of this is Algeria. Northern Africa has now, for a long time we heard about Yemen and Somalia, various places like that, but now we're hearing about Algeria, Mali. It seems like it has become, or been allowed to become, a very dangerous place.
Yeah, this is something I worked on in the Senate on the Africa subcommittee, and I've been working on for the last couple of years. North Africa is a very dangerous place in terms of the growth of Al-Qaeda. The guy that masterminded this thing, Mokhtar Belmokhtar, is operating out of Mali, but he's an Algerian. And he was one of the people that went with bin Laden in Afghanistan back in the early 90s. 3,000 Algerians who came back to Algeria, created a group that is metastasized into basically Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb. And they are coordinating with groups in Mali. I believe they're coordinating with groups in Nigeria called Boko Haram, with Al-Shabaab in Somalia, with Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. And these are all, if we think this is an isolated incident, if we say, well, the hostage thing is over and we can move on now, we're making a terrible mistake. We have to have a national conversation about the nature of this threat and the fact that they are coordinating and that this thing is not done.
So Al-Qaeda is not on the path to defeat. Al-Qaeda has not been decimated. Al-Qaeda is like whack-a-mole. We may have chased them out of Afghanistan.
Al-Qaeda is definitely has been hurt in other places, but is definitely on the rise in North Africa. And we're not used to dealing with that part of the world, but we have to get used to it. We have to learn about it and have a serious, sustained attention. They have sustained attention. We don't have it on this subject, and we need to.
Mr. Speaker?
Yeah, I don't think it's like whack-a-mole. I think it's like a virus. And I think we haven't had any honest epidemiology. Bliss and I did a movie called America at Risk, where we went through case by case by case the refusal to take seriously how big, and this is bipartisan, by the way. The first briefing I got on this was in December of 2001 at the CIA. And they said, look, We're trying to hunt down 5,000 people in al-Qaeda. There is a potential pool of 65 to 100 million recruits. And what we're doing is setting up a narrowly focused Iraq, Afghanistan worldview when they're spreading across the whole planet, from the Philippines to, frankly, the United States. And I think we greatly underestimate how many places you're going to have trouble in the next decade.
But, you know, we know something about the response that the administration's going to have. It's going to be different from the one we had the first time around after 9/11. We're not going to be invading Iraq and Afghanistan with U.S. troops. We're going to have a very different approach. We know that because that's President Obama's preference, and that's the preference of the people he's put now named for the as Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense. It's a different U.S. response. It's going to be much more limited, more strategic, more dependent on drones.
And frankly, a superior approach, because what happened to the Bush administration is he decided to invade Iraq, a country that wasn't even on the list of al-Qaeda, completely distracted us from this growth that the speaker talked about. This has been going on all over the world, but somehow we focus on a country-by-country basis. President Obama, I think, gets it on this, and he's appointing people who understand the delicate nature of trying to look at the interconnections, and I'm very pleased about that.
And, well, I agree with Susan about what the U.S. would and would not do in Mali and Algeria and all of that. It can be very distracting to a domestic agenda if things start to blow up.
Sure.
Overseas.
And that's one of the challenges you face in a second term. I mean, the longer you hang around 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, you know, the odds start rising against you that bad things are going to happen in the world that you're going to have to deal with, whether it's something like this or Iran. I would also say the issue in Africa is going to be more acute going forward because Africa kind of looms as part of this changing energy equation, much more energy opportunity. There can be more kind of Western investment potentially developing the energy resources that would create more vulnerability to these kinds of things. So it's clearly going to be on the agenda. And you're right. I mean, as the term extends for president, the chance for things to go wrong in the world rises for them too.
Well, and part of the problem is we think of it, things will go wrong. We can't just focus on domestic issues. We can't be taken by surprise like we were on 9/11. That was the problem. We were having things like impeachment trials and so on instead of realizing that bin Laden was active. We need to be as focused on foreign issues as domestic issues.
Are we?
No,
I don't think we are.
We're not, and this is a bipartisan problem because nobody wants to think deeply enough about what's going on. We talk about the Iranian potential nuclear weapon. Pakistan is probably building more nuclear weapons than any other country in the world right now. Pakistan's a very fragile system which could disintegrate at any time. We're not prepared for that. The whole challenge of the Persian Gulf, we're not prepared for that. The level of violence in Syria. Now, I think it's accurate to say that by appointing the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Defense that he has, John Kerry and Hagel, they're communicating accurately a minimalist approach to the world, and that's you can make a case for that. But neither of them nor the president have a positive vision of how you're going to deal with a worldwide virus that is increasingly destabilizing the planet. And that's what's happening from Pakistan through North Africa to Syria, and I think potentially in Europe and the United States.
I have less than a minute here, so I need one-word answers from you. Joe Biden made a bit of a slip-up, we think, yesterday talking about how happy he was to be president of the United States. 2016, is there any doubt in your mind that Joe Biden is there?
Joe Biden would be very happy to be president of the United States, and I think he is planning to run, if possible.
I think he wants to, but I'm not sure that he will.
Why not?
The American people deserve a break from presidential campaigning.
Yeah, there you go.
Oh, there's one in every crowd. Ron Brownstein, Susan Page, Newt Gingrich, Russ Feingold, thank you all so much this morning.
Thank you.